Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It is a temperate day here in suburban Chicago. It's Monday afternoon, and I'm re-recording the episode that I did this morning because the one from this morning was ruined. Ruined, I say. I went for a walk this morning and recorded a lovely podcast for you. And I got home and listened to it, and the whole thing was filled with scritchy scratch noises. Apparently, I somehow clipped my microphone to my shirt in a bad way, and it scraped against the shirt the whole time. So it was making this scritch scratch noise for the entire walk. So it was unusable. So I'm re-recording. I don't know if this means I will be more or less eloquent. I generally find I have less to say in the second class when I teach two classes in a row of the same material. The second class I have less to say. Not sure if it's that I'm more refined or I'm tired. It could go either way on that one. Yeah, I'm not sure which is the answer here. I had this over the weekend. We cleaned up the house a little bit, did some repair work and whatnot. Looked at a variety of things, including our autumn decorations. My wife asked me to climb up into the garage and get down the bins labeled fall or autumn. And we got out some pumpkins and some like plastic pumpkins and some orange table runners and all sorts of good stuff that we use to decorate the house in the autumn. And that got me thinking that I had not talked about autumn here on the podcast. And sure enough, I looked back and I have done other season related board Game Sommelier episodes, but I have not done one around the theme of autumn. So that's what I decided I'm doing today. For those of you new to the podcast, the Board Game Sommelier is a way for me to engage with a particular theme. What I do is I choose a subject and then I pick out a series of subtopics. And for each subtopic, I will I'll offer you a text and to go with it, a game that engages with that subject and helps us think about it a little bit as a collective, as a group. The harvest. Autumn. Often as we talk about autumn or we think about autumn as a experience, one of the main things we think about is the fall harvest season. Now this is not something for which I had an easy to grab text. Part of me thought about, I only have two movies that I can think of that have much to do with farming. The first is Field of Dreams, which is about a guy who doesn't want to be a farmer, he wants to do baseball instead. And that takes place in the summer. So not during harvest time. And then the second one, Son-in-Law, the Pauly Shore movie, in which a California boy comes back to Wisconsin to visit the family of one of the kids who went to his college. He's like an RA at a college, and one of the people staying in his dorm needs a friend or something. I don't remember why he goes back. Most of what I remember is that it's supposed to take place in Wisconsin and Thanksgiving, and it's sunny and people aren't wearing jackets. And in Wisconsin and Thanksgiving it is cold and snowy. It's also mostly a chance for Pauly Shore to make weird squeaky noises, as he's wont to do. If I sound a little distracted, it's because I am walking a different route because I need to mail some cards. We do not have a good mailbox near my house. And in fact, the only outgoing mailbox that we have available to us is actually pretty far away from my house. So I'm walking to it today rather than, usually what I'll do is I'll wait to mail something till I have an errand to run that'll bring me driving by the mailbox, but I don't have an errand. And I had to re-record this podcast anyway, so I'm walking there. All right, so if you wanted to watch a film, the two I had to offer you were Son-in-Law or Field of Dreams, both about farmers, but not really about farming or the harvest. You know, the other one to think about was Grapes of Wrath, which is, of course, about farming in the era of the Dust Bowl and the terrible plight of the Oklahoma farmer destroyed by erosion. So grim circumstances, but that's, harvest is what you think of when you think of the fall. So the game to go with that, there's an obvious one, and that's going to be Agricola. Agricola is probably the game I talk about most on this podcast. I talk about it a lot. And it is so very much about the harvest. It is about setting up a particular set of circumstances that allow you to get just enough to feed your family, and then hopefully eke out a little bit of profit that you can use to get an extra sheep or build a stable or build some fences. And then over time, you get more and more stuff and you become more and more efficient with your time. It's an excellent game and definitely worth play if you get a chance. There are a couple other games I thought of that have to do with harvest in this same way. A more contemporary game is Fields of Green from Stronghold Games. This is the game that I had and I decided to get rid of because it just wasn't getting any play. We played it once with my family and my wife was sort of like, no thank you. And so even though I thought it was pretty good, pretty good isn't enough to keep it in the collection. So I traded it away. But that is a game that's all about efficient use of your farming space and then the harvest as the moment when you get the things back that you need. Another game that sort of more tangentially has to do with the harvest, I was thinking of the Mind Clash games Anachrony, another favorite of mine. In this game, of course, you're building up an engine, you're building up different technologies and working really hard to arrange a series of circumstances that would allow you to do well in your evacuation condition. The way the game works, you have to evacuate once the meteor comes in, and each team has a different evacuation condition. And if you do well on yours, then you can get up to 30 points, which is often half of your game-winning score. And so in that case, instead of harvesting crops, you're harvesting people. But it still feels that same thing. You are arranging a set of circumstances so you can maximize that harvest moment. So those are the texts I had to offer in the context of the subtopic harvest. So the second subtopic I want to offer has to do with the more spiritual element of the autumn, which is the end of things. That if the way I see it, the seasons have sort of four meanings. Spring is youth and birth. Summer is growth and vitality. Autumn is decay and death. And then winter is the silence between the end of one year and the beginning of the next. Some people might call autumn old age and winter death, but I really think autumn symbolizes death more than winter. By the time we get to winter, everything that dies every year is already dead. So autumn is the time when that death happens, right? Already in the Midwest here, this depends what part of the world you're in, how much this is a part of what you're doing, but here in the Midwest, we're already seeing lots of trees that are changing color and starting to lose their leaves. We're seeing the temperature get colder. We're seeing birds flying south away from the cold weather. Trees are getting ready for the winter. Plants are getting ready for the winter. Of course, we have the harvest, which I already mentioned. And so a big part of the feeling of autumn is the feeling of death or dying. And so in that regard, what's something to watch regarding that? For the text I picked out would be Death Takes a Holiday. This is a movie. They made it in the 1930s and remade it in the 70s. And then they did a remake called Meet Joe Black that was made in the early 2000s. And all three of these movies are about the figure of death personified who then decides to spend some time as a human. We also have the Showtime TV series Dead Like Me, in which people become Grim Reapers, and they have to, do the various work of Grim Reapers. I haven't actually watched it myself. But both of these are stories about death personified and dying, and they sort of take it in a more philosophical or lighthearted view. In that regard, there are some games that will do this as well. Two that are directly about death, and the sort of more cynical or funny approach would be something like Bring Out Your Dead, which is a game about surviving the medieval plague and trying to make sure that your family get prominent spots in the cemetery. And if you screw up, then the gravedigger throws your family's coffins in the river, which is generally bad. And then there's a secondary, then another game in a similar vein is one I've talked about this year. That's Ratus, which is about the bubonic plague, particularly rats spreading the bubonic plague. And again, widespread death. So, funny. There are also games that take this a bit more seriously or think about it in a bit more thoughtful way. For example, the Inca and Marcus Brand game Village, and the spin-off or alternate version of it, My Village. Both of these games are about living in a village and having multiple generations of people engaged in the experience of living and growing and learning and dying in the village. And part of what you try to do as you play is you record the experiences or the expertise of those people in the village like logbook or whatever it's called. And so there's this sense of as people grow or as people get older, they pass on as a natural part of the cycle of life. And so part of what I find interesting about this story or about this game is the idea that death is part of nature and part of what we're exploring, part of what we have to experience no matter what. And if you want to experience that in both game and movie form, there are some examples of that. But autumn is also more about the sort of the creepy times as well, right? Halloween is a significant holiday in autumn. In fact, I've done a top scary games board Game Sommelier episode specifically about frightening games, and so I'm not going to redo that here. But I think there's something to be said for thinking about this scary tales of the autumn. In particular, the granddaddy of those that I would point to is the granddaddy of those that I would point to is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow from Washington Irving. This is the classic tale of madness and mayhem told in colonial America. It's about a possible haunting, but really about chasing a jock chasing an intellectual out of town, which is a sort of funny sideline. The intellectual is snobby and rude. But there's a really interesting side narrative in the book Nerds, Who They Are and Why We Need More of Them, about how this kind of story promotes the idea that intellectualism is bad and effete and not manly in interesting ways. Of course, there are theatrical versions of this as well. There's the Disney cartoon, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which has the sort of string bean Ichabod Crane and the leaves and the jack-o'-lantern and so on. And then there's also the Johnny Depp movie, Sleepy Hollow, which has a lot of the same characteristics and ambiance as those stories. In fact, it's obviously a retelling of that story. But I think there's something to be said for a tale that sort of takes place in New England and takes advantage of the leaves changing and the incoming cold and so on. If you want to play a game that does that, there are two obvious answers. One is one from the series of Arkham games. These take place in New England. They have to do with the sort of fear of the old forests that were there. The downside, of course, is that these games don't feel particularly autumnal, usually. They often involve the rural versus the urban landscapes and unknown or unknowable fears, but they don't necessarily feel like they take place in the fall. By contrast, a game like A Touch of Evil, even though I don't think it specifically articulates that it takes place in the fall, definitely feels like it takes place in the fall. So if you're looking for a game that seems to have that autumnal feel, A Touch of Evil is the one I would recommend. Maybe watch that along with Sleepy Hollow, and you could go into A Touch of Evil and you could play the Headless Horseman scenario where that's the villain. Then you'd have a really nice, creepy fall evening, have some apple cider, and it'd be great. So that's the creepy story side of the autumnal games. Which brings me to my last subtopic, and this is something that I think fits what autumn is and fits the idea of autumn, but really doesn't fit me. And that's, in America, autumn is the time of American football. Football is a sport that is played in the fall. There are other sports as well, but particularly football. People think of it as an autumn sport. Thanksgiving Day is a huge football day. A lot of people think of that as much as they do food. And so football seems like the thing there. When you're talking about football movies, there's a couple. There's Friday Night Lights is a big one that people enjoy. There's a couple more sort of action movies, Any Given Sunday or The Last Boy Scout are both football-themed action movies. But the one football movie that I think of, and as somebody who doesn't really care about professional sports, the only football movie I've watched more than once, I think, is Rudy. The story of triumph and heartache and continuing to try even when people tell you you can't succeed. Starring Sean Astin. It's an excellent movie. If you haven't ever seen Rudy, I highly recommend it. It's available for rental on Amazon Prime. Last time I looked, the rental price was $2.99 and the purchase price was $3.99. So I think last time we watched it, we purchased it for $3.99 so I can watch it anytime I like. It is a phenomenal movie, really nice. Also features a young Jon Favreau as well as Sean Astin. So you get a little bit of a view of somebody who would go on to write and direct a lot of really big movies. As for games, there aren't a ton of football games. Part of it is, I think, that sports games are hard to make good as board games. I'm not sure why. I think it's because you're making a game out of a game. So football is already a game, and now you're making it into a game with a board game. But since a lot of what's going on in football is it's a game of dexterity and skill, it's hard to make a board game out of that. By contrast, but there are some football games that stand out. I haven't played it, but Blood Bowl is very popular. This is a fantasy game sort of loosely based on American football. There's Blood Bowl Team Manager, which is more like being the coach or the manager of a football team. And then I know that there's Football Highlights 2052 or something like that. It's a football game inspired by the same as the baseball highlights genre. I haven't played any of these games, so I can't speak of whether they're good, but if football is the thing for you, perhaps watch Rudy and play one of those games. If I were going to pick, I would probably pick Football Highlights 2052, but that's just me. So what elements of autumn did I forget? What would you have added if you were doing the board game sommelier? What crucial texts would you have added for any of these subtopics, or what additional subtopics would you add? Hop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know. I'm Wombat929 over there. You could also email me, Brendan@Rattlebox Games. Well, that's about it for me today. Thanks for joining me. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.